When the Allies landed in Normandy, there was one single factor that more than anything condemned the Germans to inevitable defeat, and it was utter and total air superiority from the Allies' side. In this video, I want to share a glimpse of a German account of what it was like for even the most elite and experienced soldiers with the best equipment to endure some of the completely wild, novel and never to be repeated experiments of Allied air power in their absolute desperation to break out more than a month after landing in Normandy, where they were holding a bridgehead only 20% of the size of their set expectations, and when the fate of freedom and democracy still hung in the balance. Much has been made of the importance of tanks and tank battles, with some due consideration given to the tactical superiority of combined arms warfare, including close air support. Infamously are especially accounts of the screaming Stuka dive bombers wreaking havoc with pinpoint accuracy on the French during the German steamrolling of France and the British Expeditionary Forces in 1940. However, some depictions of the fighting in World War II have often overly focused on the importance of tank warfare itself, probably due to the awe-inspiring place these machines fill in our imagination, as well as due to the massive headspace the German panzers filled in the Allied soldiers on the ground. The same soldiers whose account of World War II became the primary source of truth for the first history books post-war. No doubt the German heavy panzers like the Tigers, Panthers or even the King Tigers were awe-inspiring foes, with the combination of their high-caliber guns, heavy armor and technical advance. However, regardless of their armor, they were susceptible to attacks from above, as well as any attack that made them less maneuverable, including on their tracks or their engines. Especially the German equipment was notoriously complicated and needed often not readily available spare parts and specialist engineers to repair the defects that would happen all the time during fighting or even just driving around in the mud, especially if the tanks would not be able to be pulled back with regular intervals for maintenance, which was often not the case during strong offensives of the Allies or even the Soviets for that matter. Easily the most effective weapon the Allies relied upon to tackle these tanks would be air power. The case of Operation Goodwood provides a striking account of what air power could do to tanks and men, and no more noteworthy than the recollections of Richard Freiheer Von Rosen, a heavily decorated German tank commander, in his book Panzer Ace. For the operation, the Allies had come up with the idea of using their strategic heavy bombers as direct ground support in the late night prior to ground attacks. More than 7,800 tons of bombs were dropped by 2,077 Allied aircrafts. This compares in scale well to the catastrophic bombing of Hamburg in 1943, where 9,000 tons of bombs were dropped from 3,000 bombers. However, this awesome amount of firepower was to be dropped in 8 small areas around the small villages of Cagny, southeast of Caen, which were deemed German strongpoints, each area with dimension mostly around 500 meters width and just 2 kilometers in length or less. In total, around 8 square kilometers were targeted. Our Hamburg comparison raid targeted an area at least 3 times as large. This gives some perspective to the insanity of this raid. Note that the Hamburg bombing killed more than 44,000 civilians, so we are talking absolutely overwhelming firepower at work. Later it was determined that the firepower was simply too insane to employ on the battlefield, as it reshaped the contours of the landscape to an extent to make it extremely hard to attack into, very counterproductive for an offensive. It is safe to say it does not get worse than being targeted by this kind of firepower. Now back to Von Rosen and his gunner, who was sleeping in the exact target area of the bombing along with his fellow company and was rudely awoken at 0600 hours by aircraft approaching. Creeping out of his slit trench under the Tiger, he moved through the foliage that was camouflaging them and watched Christmas tree marker flares dropping slowly to the ground all around them. Bombs began whistling down, and just 200 yards away, enormous geysers of earth erupted into the sky, followed by a violent pressure wave that almost knocked him off his feet. Von Rosen noted, "Seconds later, I was back beneath the Panzer, and not a moment too soon, for a second stick of a bomb fell much nearer. The Panzer shook, and my eardrums hurt with the pressure. I realized at once that this attack was aimed at us personally. From now on, I could not think. I was as helpless as a drowning man tossed into raging seas. The air was filled with the whistle of falling bombs, and instinctively I pressed myself closer to the ground. Then, following the deafening explosions and attendant air pressure, increasingly louder as the chain of explosions ran its course towards us. Each aircraft dropped not a single bomb, but a batch of 15 or 20. The bombers came in staggered formation of 10 to 15 aircraft, all dropping their bomb loads simultaneously, wave after wave. The ground trembled. It surprised me that I could have survived it. I had a feeling of total helplessness in this presence of these explosive forces. There was no running away from them. I had no idea how long the bombing would go on. All idea of time was lost. It seemed an eternity since I had lain peacefully asleep under my panzer. Suddenly, we were catapulted by the blast into a corner of the trench, hovered over with the earth, and were probably unconscious for some time until we came back. The blaster swept away the excavated earth which we had lined along with tracks and wheels of the panzer, and so I could now see through the wheels. My neighboring panzer was ablaze. Tiger 312 Unteroffizier Westerhuysen's panzer had received a direct hit. That was all I could see from my slit trench, although I realized that the blast had shifted my own panzer slightly to one side. Probably the near miss which knocked us out had caused it. Then it all started again. Down came the next shower of bombs. As I seem to remember, the whole performance lasted 2.5 hours with short pauses. It would be superfluous to repeat the same event occurring over and over. I lay under my panzer with my fingers in my ears and bit my blankets so I would not cry out. When it was all over, Von Rosen later described vividly the total confusion in the aftermath, noting, "What a sight met my ears as I crawled out from under my panzer. Of the once so beautiful parkland, nothing remained but shredded trees, churned meadows, and giant bomb craters, so numerous that they overlapped. A grey, repulsive moonscape and a mist of dust which made breathing difficult. Through the thick fog, it was possible to see the red glow of trees and cornfields burning. That was my first impression as I stood behind my panzer and had a look around. It was incomprehensible how the surroundings had changed. Then life returned. The crews crept out of their slit trenches under the panzers or from within them, pale and bewildered, more suspecting than knowing how close to death they had been. I went to the panzer on our right. It had received a direct hit and looked like a giant open sardine tin. Flames licked the wreckage. Of Unteroffizier Westerhuysen and his crew, there was no trace. I worked my way through a veritable primeval woodland and now came to the gigantic crater in front of Oberfeldwebel Sachs Tiger 313. The panzer itself had been flipped over by the blast and now lay on its turret, wheels in the air. We found 2 crewmen dead under it, and of the other 3, there were no trace. Where my frontline repair group had been was only a crater. There would have been 5 or 6 men who had sought shelter beneath their 2 panzers, but now they could not be found. The platoon leaders arrived, still confused. We had no time to discuss what we had just lived through. However, now we had to act. We had to restore our panzers to operational status, but most of them first had to be shoveled free from the earth piled up to the turrets. Some had fallen on trees across them and their tracks broken. With our few tools aboard, 2 shovels and a pickaxe per panzer, how were we to get the company operational again? Additionally, the work had to be broken off frequently when salvos from heavy artillery, probably naval guns, targeted our area. The men made a superhuman effort, for we knew now that it was life or death. I also noticed that 10 meters behind my panzer was a crater 6 to 8 meters deep, which would have swallowed it up comfortably if the bomb had landed a fraction of a second later. It would have been a direct hit and these memoirs would never have been written. The thick armor plate over the engine at the rear of the panzer had been deformed as though hit by a bomb that had failed to explode. Upon examination, we established that the cooling unit had been damaged by blast. My panzer was therefore not combat worthy and I had to change vehicles again. Our situation was now fairly difficult. We could hear tank guns and MG fire not too far off. Had the British broken through, and were they already this close? I had not been able to restore radio contact with Abteilung and had no idea how they might have got on. I also had no idea who on our defensive front would still be in a position to repulse a British attack after the murderous bombardment. In order to clarify the situation, I set off on foot for Abteilung. The whole time enemy artillery fire was incessant, much louder than before, and the shelling reaching much closer to us. I jumped from crater to crater, always with an eye for cover, whenever I heard a fresh salvo whistling over. Thus my progress was laborious, what with the tree trunks and great craters I had to surmount. Finally I reached a path which led along the boundary of the parkland to Emilville. There were fewer bomb-pitted areas here, and the going was easier. From behind a bend on the road, the Tiger 1 of Hauptmann Fromme came towards me. I reported the status of the company, and he ordered me to get it out of the readiness area as soon as possible and set up a defensive front on the left flank of the suspected British attack corridor between Manneville and Cagny. This would prevent a breakthrough in the direction of Emiville. At first, it remained uncertain how long the company would need before it could move out. The noise of fighting from the west had grown so loud meanwhile that I could not be sure that the British would allow me the time to restore operational readiness. I could hear a great droning sound, as if a large number of vehicles were moving up from north to south, but nothing could be seen. A delicate veil of smoke lay over the land. Von Rosen hurried back. At company it still looked unpromising. 3 Tigers of my 1st platoon were write-offs, and work was going all out on the 4th. 2nd platoon reported the hope of having 3 Panzers operational soon. My main concern was whether we could beat the British to it. If their tanks arrived right now in the readiness area, we would have to attempt to evade capture using close combat weapons. The operational Panzers went to the park entrance gate. It was difficult to steer these mighty and to some extent cumbersome Tigers between the giant craters. Anybody who has seen woodland after a hurricane, with giant trees laying around everywhere, can perhaps imagine how the once well cared for park now looked. We still kept hearing the noise of vehicles nearby. Between it and reports of tank guns and the clatter of MG fire, though these noises of battle seemed to be coming from much further afield. Had the British already passed us by? Where were the German troops? Had the carpet bombing wiped them all out? We had no contact with any of them, either by radio or messenger. It might have been about 1,000 hours, perhaps later, when we had 6 Panzers roadworthy. They were still listed for the workshop, but at least running, so I believed we could fire the guns. I had no idea which number Panzer I boarded. The main thing was we were rolling. After a kilometer along the park wall, we were held up southwest of Manneville. 2 of my Panzers had engine fires and could only follow at a slow speed. Around 1100 hours, we saw 2 Shermans advancing through a depression, carrying out reconnaissance against us. It was only then that we discovered more damage to our Panzers from the carpet bombing that had been detected earlier. We opened fire with our guns but fired wide. The blast had decalibrated them. Where 1 round had been sufficient before, now we needed 3. Where we had parked was also not ideal. Our view was obstructed by hedges and bushes, so that although we were to some extent under cover, we could only use our firepower with difficulty. In order to have a better field of fire, we shifted our position, for to judge by the noises, the British corridor through which they were making inroads had to run immediately in front of us. My aim was to attack them in the flank. Going around a small wood, the company drove at first to the southwest in the direction of Cagny, from where it would then turn west to the Le Precieux farmstead. That at any rate was the plan. During the maneuver there were 2 sharp explosions, one after the other. Feldwebel Schrönkropf's Panzer burst into flames. It had been penetrated by a hit from ahead, as had the Panzer Feldwebel-Müller. We retrieved the wounded and took them to the rear of a Panzer to the nearby dressing station at Manneville. The worst case was Unteroffizier Mattes with severe burns. The other Tigers pulled back 200 meters on my orders and took up fresh positions. We did not know exactly from where the fire had come. As both Panzers had received frontal hits, the shells must have been fired from Cagny, 1,200 meters ahead of us. But at this time Cagny was in German hands. It was one puzzle after another, for until then we knew of no British weapon which could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger. Von Rosen now had a short lull and was able to make contact with his superior commanders again to report on the current situation. Since it had fallen quiet in my vicinity, I walked there and reported the status of my company. 2 Tigers total write-offs with frontal penetration. Guns decalibrated, engine fires due to failure of cooling systems. We also had 16 dead. All of our panzers ought to have been at the repairs, but in this situation, in the face of the enemy, we had to act for as long as possible, as though we were capable of really serious resistance. From there, I went to the main dressing station again. Unteroffizier Mattes looked dreadfully mutilated. He had been given injections, but I doubt he recognized me. He died shortly after. I went back to our previous readiness area. The crews of the panzers abandoned there had meanwhile been brought out by our truss. I looked over the panzers. My 311 could really have been towed out. The damage to the other panzers was too serious. Oberfeldwebel Sachs 313 lay upside down. This 58-ton panzer had been simply blown over. What forces this bombardment had unleashed. I still could not believe what had swept us over there. Put very simply, there was just no way the Germans could sustain themselves against this kind of dominance from the air, as they could replenish very little of the equipment lost on the front, and never in any timely manner. If you enjoy this kind of dramatized historical storytelling, give the video a like, and I'll know to continue bringing to you stories you've never heard before.